you all for coming. So I want to get a sense of who's here in the room first. So I'd like you to raise your hand if you have school-age kids right now. Good for you. Thank you. You know, nobody could have convinced me 35 years ago that I would have written a book, that I would have ended up on the school committee in Boston. You know, if anything, I got involved with my kids as kind of an organizer, being on the school committee, being on the other side. So that was the last thing I ever expected. I had kids and sent them to the Boston Public Schools because basically that was all I knew. You know, I had never set foot in a private school when I had kids. And I just thought, you know, you live in a neighborhood, you go to the schools that come with wherever you live, and if they don't work, you figure out how to make them work. That was really naive. I wrote this book because I was very involved. You know, I got involved with my kids' schools, and then with the citywide parent council, and then with helping to start the Boston Parent Organizing Network. And then, as I mentioned, I ended up on the school committee in Boston for 8 years. And I felt like with all that experience that there was conversations that we weren't having that we should be having around the schools. And, you know, I started to write, share my writing. You know, my kids are growing up now, and I thought, oh, this was a while ago, and people said, what you're talking about was 20 years ago? Nothing's changed. So that's when I knew that this book might still be relevant. You know, so the conversations that I felt like we weren't having were about race and racism. You know, it's like the elephant in the room. It affected kind of so much of what goes on in the schools, and nobody wanted to talk about it. So that's why I wrote what I wrote. And, you know, I also felt like we weren't talking about it, but also, you know, there's a role for white people in dealing with race and racism. And, you know, we first have to kind of understand our relationship to it and what that means before we can get involved. And, you know, it's a learning process. It was a learning process for me. I certainly wasn't raised to figure out how to deal with race and racism. And so the book is really kind of talking about my learning process so that other people hopefully can learn from it and maybe skip a couple of steps along that whole path. I tied my stories to national trends because we like to think we're unique here in Boston, but in fact what goes on in the schools here is a lot like what goes on in lots of places around the country. So before I kind of go into some of the stories, I need to say that my kids got a really good education in the Boston Public Schools. You know, when I talk, I tend to talk about the problems, and there are problems, but I also feel like the schools get a bad rap, and there's a lot of good that they do have going for them, and a lot of really committed people that, you know, we dealt with all through the years. So I always feel like I do want to say that up front so it doesn't just sound like the whole conversation's about all the problems in the schools. And, you know, they got a decent education, but it was the inequities that I saw year after year that really bothered me, and still do, because they still exist. You know, it's the Black and Latino and Native American kids that are being failed by our schools. So, you know, I come at this with a basic belief that, you know, all kids start with equal potential. So you have to ask yourself, like, what's going on here that this happens, right? I found out about how long ago the Black parents in Boston first petitioned the school committee for access to equitable schools. Any idea what year that might have been?
1849? Earlier?
Oh, no.
1798. And again in 1800. And, you know, this was in a state where there was no racial segregation by law. So it was just by practice that the Black kids were sent to certain schools, not with the white kids. Both of those petitions were denied by the school committee. So the Black community was organized again during abolition period, 1840, 1844, 1845, 1846. All of those years, they again petitioned the school committee. We don't have access to equitable, to quality schools. All of those petitions were denied. So when we think about, you know, 150 years later, when the NAACP sued the school committee, you know, which resulted in the desegregation many of us know about in 1975, that's like hundreds of years after the Black community was very well organized and very clear that they weren't getting equal access to schools. So, you know, when you wonder why people don't get involved, if you look at that history and people who've come out of that history, it's easy to understand why people might feel like they're not going to be heard. And it's not an excuse for why people don't get involved, but I think understanding the history helps us understand a different way of looking at the problem. It's building relationships and reaching out and helping people to feel comfortable and feel part of things in the schools, and that's the piece that we sometimes totally forget. I talked a little about the historical institutional barriers, but there's also our attitudes. And there's an interesting twist to this because I've been doing book talks for a few months now in other cities as well as Boston, and almost every single one, there's been someone who's asked a question who's a white parent who has kids of color, whether it's through a relationship or adoption or whatever, and they've raised their hand and said, my kid's being held back by the teacher at school, and I have to go in, show the teacher the grades, show the homework, and say, he should be pushed up, not held back. What are you doing? And this has been brought up in every book talk. And, it started to make me super aware that this is the kind of stuff that parents of color are up against all the time. And as a white parent, we don't see it if it doesn't happen to us. So when we hear that kind of thing's happening, it's like, well, I don't see it happening. I don't think so. But this kind of showed another side that, yeah, it happens and things like that happen all the time. And if it doesn't happen to us and our kids, it's easy to just think it doesn't exist. Then a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to do some parent training at the Haley School. We've got a couple of parents here, several, thank you for coming, to look at how to diversify parent involvement in the school. And then we said, the Haley School in Rosendale. And we said, we're going to do this thing. We're going to try to get some folks together for a series of sessions, and we're going to talk about race, because it's the only way we're going to do this, right? And so we did. And one of the parents came to one of the sessions, and she said that her 7-year-old came home, and he asked her, Mom, why is the 5th grade all black? So what do you say to a 7-year-old who's already observing race in this way, I happen to believe that 7-year-olds are able to understand more than we sometimes give them credit for. And we can talk about tests, because they probably already know about tests, right? And how some kids do better on tests than others because they've been exposed to more things that allow them to test well. And then how the tests determine who gets invited to this advanced work program in Boston, which is not in every school. So those kids leave the school, and this is what happened at the Haley, and go elsewhere. And then it's basically all the white kids, or most of them, going off to a different school, and then those seats get filled with whoever needs seats in the school system. And there's lots of other ways you might talk about something like that. That's just the way I would do it. It's somewhat of an oversimplification, but a 7-year-old can understand that some kids don't have the same opportunities as they do, and that kids can be smart in different ways. So you can be smart in a way that allows you to do well on tests, but there's lots of other ways that we all are smart. But what happens when kids ask those kind of questions so often is we shove the question under the rug, because we don't know what to say, or we say, shh, we don't want to talk about that. And then, what does that do? The kids kind of fill in the blanks in whatever the way they can. And the most obvious way is that the kids who look like me are smarter than those other kids. And then the flip side happens where the kids of color who are, all left behind in this 4th and 5th grade class get the other message where we're the dumb ones, because we're here and the smart kids all went over there. And so this is like 7, 8, 9 years old. The kids are already internalizing that sense of inferiority or superiority. And this is what happens if we don't talk about it. This is what happens all over the country. So for a long time I was like that 7-year-old, only I was afraid to ask the question out loud. I saw things like we all do, differences that happen along racial lines, and was afraid to ask about it because I thought, I might say something really stupid. I might say something really racist. So I didn't ask for a long time. But it drove me crazy that nobody was talking about race. And, you could see all these things happening at the Trotter School. There's a few people here whose kids were there with mine. When my kids went there, the school was maybe 85% kids of color, and the parent meetings were over half white parents. And we didn't talk about it, right? Let's see. Then, first when it really hit me was when I got on the site council and we were looking at the standardized test scores, because that was before the MCAS, where there was less kind of talk about standardized tests. And here we get these test scores broken down by race, and the scores, the average scores of the Black and Latino kids were literally half the average scores of the white and Asian kids, and nobody said anything. And I was thinking at the time, well, a parent of color should raise this question. Now I kind of look like, well, why would that be? But I think that's kind of what goes through our minds often as white parents. And nobody did, and I finally had to ask. And we had a great principal, Mary Leonard, who explained, kids do well on tests for a whole lot of reasons and don't do well for a whole lot of reasons. And, this is a trend. And, we kind of had a conversation about it. It's like, oh, you can ask the question and then you get some answers and you learn something about how these things happen. I've been in a number of schools and seen the dynamic where there's a tendency for the white middle-class parents to become very active in the school. And again, that's a good thing. There's nothing in itself that's wrong with that. But the problematic part is when those are the parents that start setting the agenda for the school, because they're the ones that are active. And without really reaching out to see that all voices are at the table when decisions get made, whether it's policy decisions in the school or how that fundraising money is spent, it's really easy for those things to sort of benefit the people at the table, for decisions to get made that benefit the people who are most active. And then the kids who've always been struggling are still going to be the kids left behind. And so I just think that as more middle-class families come back into the schools, that we just need to be really mindful of how to, be involved in a way that encourages a broader involvement. And it takes work, it does take work.